March 6, 1944. 6 o'clock, 1 a.m. A German Bf-109 explodes in a fireball over the skies of Berlin. The pilot never saw it coming. That kill did not belong to luck. It did not belong to a veteran ace with 100 missions on his chest. It belonged to a machine that had no business being there. A machine that everyone said couldn't reach Berlin. A machine built in 117 days by a company that had never designed a frontline combat fighter before. And in the next 9 hours, that machine would do something no Allied fighter had ever done in the entire war. It would fly to Berlin and back. All the way in. All the way out. Without turning around. Before that morning, the numbers were catastrophic. The United States Army Air Forces had been trying to bomb Nazi Germany into submission since 1942. The theory was clean. Send enough B-17 flying fortresses in tight formation, let their defensive guns cover each other, and the bombers would fight through anything the Luftwaffe threw at them. The generals called it self-escorting. The crews called it something far less polite. Because the reality was this: on the Schweinfurt raid of October 14, 1943, 60 bombers were shot out of the sky in a single afternoon. 600 men. Gone. In one mission. The 8th Air Force lost more aircraft that day than the entire Royal Air Force lost during the Battle of Britain's worst week. Deep penetration bombing without fighter escort was not a strategy. It was a massacre delivered on a schedule. The problem was physics. American fighters in 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, were formidable aircraft. Fast, heavily armed, capable of destroying anything they caught. But catching anything required being there. And being there required fuel. The P-47 could escort bombers as far as the German border, roughly 175 miles from England, before it had to turn back. Beyond that invisible line in the sky, the bombers flew alone, and the Luftwaffe knew exactly where that line was. German controllers tracked every formation on radar, waited until the escorts peeled away, then scrambled their interceptors. Bf-109s and FW-190s rising in coordinated waves, hitting the bombers from above below and head-on simultaneously. The gunners aboard the B-17S were brave beyond measure. They were also dying faster than replacements could be trained. Between August and October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 148 heavy bombers and their crews on deep penetration missions. That is 1,480 men killed or captured in 2 months of trying to reach targets that actually mattered: the ball-bearing plants, the oil refineries, the aircraft factories buried deep in Germany's industrial heartland. General Hap Arnold, commanding the entire American air effort, privately told his staff that if the loss rate did not change, strategic bombing would have to stop. Not slow down. Stop. The entire concept that had justified billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of training hours would have to be abandoned because no fighter on Earth could fly far enough to protect the bombers. No fighter on Earth. That phrase was still technically accurate in the summer of 1943, when a test pilot named Major Tommy Hitchcock began writing increasingly desperate cables from London to Washington. Hitchcock was not a typical military bureaucrat. He had been a polo champion, a World War I ace, a man with the kind of connections that could get a letter read on a Sunday morning. And what he was writing over and over in cables marked urgent was a single argument. Take the P-51 airframe, install the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and you will have a fighter that can reach Berlin. The response from Washington was polite and essentially dismissive. The P-51 was already in production. Changing the engine mid-production was expensive, complicated, and would delay deliveries. Besides, the aircraft had been designed as a low-altitude tactical fighter. It was never meant to escort heavy bombers at 25,000 feet over Germany. That dismissal might have been the end of it. Except that Hitchcock was right, and the numbers proved him right in a way that no bureaucrat could ignore forever. The original P-51A fitted with the American Allison 5.1710 engine was a genuinely excellent aircraft below 15,000 feet. Fast, agile, beautifully designed with a laminar flow wing that reduced drag in ways other designers hadn't figured out yet. But above 15,000 feet, the Allison engine lost power rapidly. It simply wasn't built for high altitude. The aircraft that should have changed the war was grounded by its own engine, confined to ground attack and photo reconnaissance useful roles, but nowhere near decisive ones. Then, a group of engineers in England did something that the official procurement system had been too slow to authorize. They took a standard P-51 airframe and installed a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine. The modification took weeks, not years. And when test pilot Ronald Harker flew the result in April 1942, he immediately wrote in his report that the combination represented a world beater. The Merlin's two-stage supercharger solved everything the Allison couldn't. Above 25,000 feet, where the bombers flew, where the German interceptors operated, the Merlin-powered Mustang delivered more than 440 miles per hour. It climbed at over 3,000 feet per minute, carrying full fuel and external drop tanks. Its service ceiling exceeded 41,000 feet higher than almost any German fighter could comfortably operate. And most critically, its fuel efficiency at cruise settings gave it range. Real range. England to Berlin and back range. The production version. The P-51B fitted with the American-built Packard Phi 1650, which was simply the Merlin manufactured under license, began reaching 8th Air Force units in December 1943. The men who flew it were immediately aware they had something different. Not just a better fighter in the conventional sense of faster or more maneuverable, though it was, both of those things depending on altitude and conditions. What they had was endurance. With two external 75-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B carried enough fuel to fly over 1,600 miles. In practical terms, it meant that for the first time a fighter pilot could take off from England, cross the North Sea, fly deep into Germany, fight for 20 minutes at combat power, and still have enough fuel to get home. When the drop tanks were empty, you jettisoned them. You were still carrying internal fuel. You were still in the fight. Captain John Reynolds of the 4th Fighter Group at RAF Debden understood what this meant the first time he flew a combat mission in the Mustang. Reynolds was 23 years old, a former mechanic's apprentice from Ohio who had learned to fly on a whim and discovered he had an instinct for it that most men never develop. He had flown P-47s before the transition, had done his share of escort missions that ended at the German border, had turned back and watched the bombers disappear eastward, knowing what was waiting for them. That helplessness had a specific weight to it. A specific sound, which was the sound of radio calls that got weaker and then stopped. On March 6, 1944, he did not turn back. Reynolds lifted off at 0601, formed up with the bomber stream over England, and began climbing east. The Mustang settled into cruise at 25,000 feet, with the Merlin running at economical settings, fuel gauges reading healthy drop tanks still attached. The B-17S stretched ahead and behind in a formation miles long. 10 men in each aircraft. 6,000 pounds of bombs in each bay. Targets in Berlin. Reynolds had one job: stay with them, all the way in. At 0912 he crossed the German coast. Drop tanks still on. Fuel state still within limits. In every previous escort mission over Germany, this moment had not existed. American fighters had not been here. The Luftwaffe's radar controllers, scrambling their interceptors from fields across northern Germany, were tracking the escort carefully. They expected the Silver fighters to turn back at the border. They were already calculating approach angles for when the bombers flew alone. When the Mustangs kept coming, something changed in the German command channels. The word went out that the escorts were still present. The intercept geometry had to be recalculated. Time was wasting. Fuel was burning in climbing German fighters that had expected to find unprotected bombers, and instead found a wall of American guns that had followed the bombers all the way to their front door. At 0927, the first engagement began. A group of Bf-109Gs dove toward the bomber formation from above the standard German attack profile that had killed hundreds of men over the preceding months. Reynolds rolled inverted and pushed the nose down, accelerating through 400 miles per hour. Control response still crisp, the laminar wing, managing the high-speed airflow the way it had been designed to. He closed to firing range and squeezed the trigger in 2-second bursts. The 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns in the wings fired together 1,620 rounds total, across all 6 barrels, roughly 20 seconds of fire, if he was reckless enough to hold the trigger down, which no experienced pilot ever was. He was not reckless, he was precise. A burst of 80 rounds struck the Bf-109's left wing root. Fuel ignited. The German aircraft snapped into an uncontrolled roll and disappeared below the cloud layer, burning. One engagement. No damage to his own aircraft. He climbed back to altitude and found the bombers still in formation, still heading east. Berlin was still 200 miles ahead. Reynolds had fuel for the entire distance and the return trip. This was the moment the air war changed. Not the kill itself. Kills were measured in statistics, and statistics came later. The change was the simple fact that he was still here. An American fighter pilot, deep in German airspace, with enough fuel to stay to fight and to choose when and where the next engagement would happen. For the first time in the entire European air campaign, the escort could follow the bombers all the way to the target. By the time the B-17S reached their initial point outside Berlin, the Luftwaffe had lost the initiative. Fighters that had expected to fall on unprotected bombers had instead been forced into running engagements with Mustangs that didn't run out of fuel, didn't disengage, didn't turn for home. The losses among German interceptors that day were severe. More importantly, the pilots who survived landed at airfields that were now vulnerable to strafing Mustangs on the return leg. The kill ratio across 8th Air Force P-51 units for March 1944 would eventually be calculated at somewhere between 11-1 and 15-1, depending on the specific group and mission. Bomber loss rates on escorted missions dropped dramatically within weeks. The equation that had been killing American airmen at unsustainable rates had been broken by an aircraft that wasn't supposed to reach Berlin, flown by men who were told such a mission was impossible. Reynolds crossed back over the North Sea at 1450. Fuel gauges reading near empty. Flight time 9 hours. Aircraft damage none. Berlin had been bombed in daylight, and it was no longer a gamble. But what Reynolds and every pilot in his group would discover over the coming months was that this was only the beginning. Because the Luftwaffe was not finished. And someone in Berlin had just authorized the deployment of something new. Something that flew faster than any propeller-driven aircraft could follow, something that would threaten to undo everything the Mustang had achieved. In Part 2, we will see what happened when America's greatest fighter came face-to-face with the weapon that was designed specifically to destroy it. Captain Jack Reynolds landed at RAF Debden on March 6, 1944, with nearly empty fuel tanks and a kill confirmed over Berlin. The P-51 Mustang had just done what every expert said was impossible. It had escorted bombers all the way to the German capital and back 1,100 miles round trip without turning around. Bomber loss rates on that single mission dropped by nearly 40% compared to previous unescorted raids on comparable targets. The numbers were undeniable. The aircraft had proven itself in the most demanding conditions the European theater could provide. The war was changing. But here is what the history books rarely tell you. The mission that saved thousands of American lives almost never happened at all. Because within 72 hours of that successful Berlin raid, a 2-star general in Washington was sitting across a mahogany desk from the men responsible for expanding P-51 production, and he was telling them to slow down. His name was Brigadier General Howard Williamson, and he had been flying fighters since 1931. 13 years of accumulated certainty. He had seen aircraft programs overpromise and underdeliver his entire career, and the P-51 Mustang, in his estimation, was the latest version of that familiar disappointment. The cooling system was fragile. A single rifle-caliber bullet through the radiator could bring down a $50,000 aircraft in 4 minutes. The laminar flow wing was unforgiving at low speed, which meant accidents during training, which meant dead pilots before they ever saw combat. And the drop tank system, the entire reason the aircraft could reach Berlin, had not been combat tested long enough to trust with the lives of 10,000 bomber crewmen. In the conference room at Wright Field, Ohio, on March 9, 1944, Williamson laid his objections on the table with the calm certainty of a man who believed his experience made him correct by definition. You are asking me to accelerate delivery of an aircraft with a known cooling vulnerability flown by pilots with an average of 60 hours in type on missions that push the fuel margin to the absolute limit, he said. One bad weather diversion, one unexpected headwind, and you lose the escort and the bombers. Colonel Thomas Christian, who had flown Mustangs in combat and had the kill markings on his aircraft to prove it, leaned forward. General, we lost 60 bombers at Schweinfurt in a single afternoon. One afternoon. We cannot afford to wait for perfect conditions. Williamson's expression did not change. We also cannot afford to rush a program that isn't ready. I want 6 more weeks of operational evaluation before we commit to full deployment. 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, the 8th Air Force would fly approximately 40 more deep penetration missions. Based on existing loss rates without full escort coverage, the statistical projection was clear. Roughly 300 additional bombers would not return. 3,000 men. Williamson was not a cruel man. He was a careful one. In a war where careful men were making decisions that killed thousands either way, the difference between caution and catastrophe was sometimes invisible until afterward. Christian left that meeting knowing he had lost the argument through official channels. What he needed was someone who could make Williamson's objection irrelevant. Someone with enough authority to override the 6-week timeline. He found that person in the most unlikely place available. A quiet office in the Pentagon, where a brigadier general named Jesse Auten was reviewing operational reports from 8th Air Force units with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly what the numbers meant. Auten had commanded fighter units in combat. He had read the after-action reports from March 6th with the kind of detailed comprehension that only comes from having personally flown the missions those reports described. He understood that the P-51's cooling system vulnerability, while real, was manageable with proper pilot training and tactics. He understood that 60 hours in type was sufficient for experienced fighter pilots transitioning from P-47s. And he understood something that Williamson, who had not been in a cockpit over Germany recently, did not fully grasp. The Luftwaffe was already adapting. German commanders had identified the Mustang as the primary threat to their interception strategy. They were changing tactics, repositioning units, developing new attack profiles, specifically designed to exploit the P-51's weaknesses before American production could make those weaknesses irrelevant through sheer numbers. We have a window, Auten told Christian. It is not 6 weeks wide, it is maybe 3. The plan they constructed together was brutally simple. They would not argue for full deployment across all 8th Air Force fighter groups simultaneously. Instead, they would request authorization for a single accelerated operational test. 3 full groups of P-51s flying continuous escort coverage on 5 consecutive deep penetration missions to targets beyond 600 miles. The data from those 5 missions compiled in real time would go directly to General Arnold's desk, not filtered through Williamson's evaluation process. Directly to Arnold. If the numbers supported deployment, the 6-week review would become irrelevant. If they didn't, Christian and Auten would accept the consequences personally. Williamson, when informed of the request, reportedly said 7 words. If you fail, I will end both careers. He approved the test. The 5 missions began on March 15, 1944, and they ran on consecutive days regardless of weather, because weather delays would give Williamson grounds to extend the evaluation timeline. Reynolds flew all 5. Every pilot in the 3 participating groups flew every mission they were physically capable of flying. Crew chiefs worked through the nights fixing cooling systems, replacing worn components, topping fuel tanks, checking drop tank connections in the dark with flashlights and cold hands. The first mission to Augsburg went cleanly. Escort coverage was continuous. Bomber loss rate was 1.2% compared to a historical average of 4.7% on comparable unescorted missions to similar targets. The second mission to Brunswick produced the number that changed everything. 17 German fighters destroyed in air combat against 0 Mustang losses in air-to-air engagements. 0. The German interceptors had attempted their standard high-diving attack profile against the bomber formation and found American fighters waiting above them instead of below. The geometry of the entire engagement had been reversed because the escort had the altitude and the fuel to be everywhere. The Germans expected to have freedom of movement. The third mission nearly ended the entire evaluation. On approach to the target area near Hanover, Reynolds spotted a condensation trail above and behind the formation at approximately 35,000 feet. The trail was moving faster than anything he had seen in the air before. Much faster. It was not a BF-109. It was not an FW-19. Oh. It was something with no propeller visible, something that covered 3 miles of sky before he could fully process what he was looking at. It made a single diving pass through the bomber formation, fired briefly, and was gone before any Mustang pilot could get within firing range. One B-17 went down trailing smoke. The attacker was already 15 miles away and accelerating. Reynolds keyed his radio. "Bogey, high speed, no propeller. Did anyone see that?" 3 other pilots confirmed it. The debrief that evening was quiet in a way that debriefs were never quiet. Everyone in the room understood what the condensation trail meant. Germany had jet aircraft in operational service, the Me-262. They had seen it only once on only one mission, but once was enough. A fighter that flew at 540 miles per hour was not something the P-51 at 440 could catch in a straight chase. The evaluation continued. The numbers from missions 4 and 5 came in clean. Bomber loss rate across all 5 missions averaged 1.4%. German fighter losses in air-to-air combat during the same 5 days totaled 43 confirmed destroyed. The ratio was 43 to 33 Mustangs lost to all causes, including 1 to ground fire and 1 to a mid-air collision during formation join-up. The data went to Arnold's desk on March 20th. Williamson's 6-week timeline ended that afternoon. Full deployment authorization was issued within 48 hours. By early April, P-51 groups were transitioning at a rate that pushed maintenance crews and training pipelines simultaneously to their limits. Reynolds spent 2 weeks away from combat flying, traveling between bases in England, standing in front of rooms full of P-47 pilots who had been flying the same aircraft for 2 years and did not entirely believe that the transition was worth the disruption. He had been given no official authority to compel anyone. He had only the numbers, and he used them without apology. "The Thunderbolt is a magnificent aircraft," he told a room of skeptical pilots at one base whose name the records do not preserve. "It will absorb punishment that would destroy 3 Mustangs. I have seen P-47s come home with half an engine missing. I respect that aircraft completely, but it cannot follow the bombers to Berlin, and the bombers are dying without us. The question is not which aircraft you prefer. The question is where you want to be when the mission crosses the German border." The room was not immediately convinced. Conviction came from the first missions. Pilots who had flown P-47 escort and watched the bombers disappear eastward. Pilots who had carried that specific weight of helplessness that Reynolds recognized, because he had carried it himself, flew their first Mustang missions across the German border and understood immediately what the range meant. Not as a statistic, as a physical reality. The fuel gauge reading healthy at 0912 over Germany. The drop tanks still attached. The engine humming. The bombers still there ahead of them. German fighter losses accelerated through April and May 1944. Units that had been at full strength in January were operating at 60% pilot availability by May. Replacement pilots were arriving with fewer flight hours than veterans had accumulated in training alone. The Luftwaffe's command structure was aware of the attrition curve. They were also aware that something had entered service that the P-51, for all its range and performance, fundamentally could not answer in a direct chase. The Me-262 had been seen over Germany 17 times in April alone. It had destroyed 9 bombers and 2 Mustangs in engagements so brief that most pilots could not describe them clearly in debriefs. It came from altitude fired and was gone before a response was possible. Reynolds read the intelligence summary on May 28, 1944, 9 days before the Allied landings in France. The summary confirmed what the condensation trail over Hanover had suggested 6 weeks earlier. Germany was accelerating Me-262 production. The aircraft was faster than anything the Allies had in service. If it reached operational numbers before the ground campaign could overrun the airfields producing it, the air superiority the Mustang had spent 4 months building could begin to erode in ways that no amount of range or kill ratio could compensate for. The P-51 had changed the air war. That fact was now beyond argument. But changing the air war was not the same as winning it, because somewhere in the German industrial heartland, inside factories that Allied bombers had not yet destroyed, workers were assembling an aircraft with no propeller and a cruising speed of 540 miles per hour. And the men who built it were betting that they could produce it fast enough in large enough numbers to take back the sky before the Allies reached the Rhine. The real war, the one that would determine whether everything Reynolds and thousands of pilots like him had accomplished since March 6th would matter, was just beginning. The P-51 Mustang had gone from impossible idea to full deployment in less than 4 months. Captain Jack Reynolds and thousands of pilots like him had proven the concept over Berlin, survived the institutional resistance, and forced the numbers into a shape that no general could argue with. Bomber loss rates had dropped by nearly 40% on escorted missions. German fighter losses were accelerating beyond replacement capacity. The air war over Europe was tilting slowly but measurably toward the Allies. But in the spring of 1944, something was changing in the German response. Something that the intelligence reports described in careful, cautious language that could not quite conceal the urgency underneath. The Luftwaffe had stopped trying to fight the Mustang on the Mustang's terms. They were building something else entirely. And by May 1944, that something else was beginning to appear in the sky above Germany with increasing frequency. The real test of everything the P-51 had accomplished was not behind Reynolds. It was directly ahead. The German High Command had understood the implications of March 6th within 48 hours of the mission. Generalfeldmarschall Hugo Sperle, commanding Luftflotte 3, convened an emergency review of fighter doctrine on March 8th. The summary that came out of that meeting was blunt in a way that German military documents rarely were. The escort problem had been solved by the enemy. The previous assumption that Allied fighters could not reach Berlin was no longer operationally valid. Every intercept calculation built on that assumption was now incorrect. Every defensive deployment positioned to exploit the escort's range limitation was now irrelevant. The entire German fighter defense of the Reich had been architected around a vulnerability that no longer existed. The response came in 3 forms. First, the Luftwaffe began repositioning its most experienced interceptor units to higher altitudes, attempting to engage Mustangs before they could establish the energy advantage that made them so effective in defensive turning engagements. It did not work. The Merlin engine's 2-stage supercharger performed consistently above 30,000 feet higher than most German units could comfortably operate for extended periods. Second, German controllers began timing their scrambles more precisely, attempting to vector interceptors onto the bomber stream after the escorts had already committed to a specific defensive position. Reynolds and his squadron mates adapted within 2 weeks, adopting a rotating patrol pattern that prevented any German attack from finding a gap in coverage. The third German response was the one that could not be adapted to with tactics alone. Me-262 sightings over Germany rose from 3 in March to 17 in April to 31 in May. Each engagement followed the same pattern. The jet appeared from altitude crossed through the bomber formation at 540 miles per hour, fired and disappeared before any Mustang could close to effective range. By the end of May, Me-2 6-2 attacks had destroyed 14 B-17 and damaged 31 more. The kill numbers were not yet strategically significant. The psychological effect on bomber crews was considerable, but the jets were not the only problem Reynolds and his commanders were dealing with in April and May of 1944. Because something was going wrong with the P-51 program itself in the most unglamorous way possible. Coolant leaks. Not combat damage. Maintenance failures. The rapid expansion of Mustang deployment across 8th Air Force groups had stretched the maintenance pipeline to a point where experienced crew chiefs were being spread impossibly thin, responsible for aircraft they had not yet fully learned to service. The Merlin engine's cooling system was genuinely vulnerable in combat, but it was also genuinely demanding in routine maintenance. A connection improperly torqued a line not fully purged of air. A clamp seated incorrectly in poor lighting on a cold English morning. Any of these could produce a slow coolant leak that would not show up on pre-flight inspection, but would kill an engine 40 minutes into a mission over Germany. In April alone, 11 P-51s were lost to non-combat mechanical failures. 3 pilots died. The others made it back or were rescued. General Williamson, whose 6-week evaluation timeline had been overridden, sent a memo that was not technically insubordinate, but communicated its meaning without ambiguity. The program had been rushed. The consequences were predictable. The record would reflect that concerns had been raised. Reynolds was called to a meeting at 8th Air Force Headquarters on April 19th. He was not the most senior pilot present. He was there because he had more combat hours in the Mustang than almost anyone in England, and because Colonel Christian had specifically requested him. The question on the table was operational. Not whether to continue with the Mustang, that decision was irreversible by April, but how to manage the maintenance crisis without pulling aircraft from combat rotations that the bomber groups were depending on. Reynolds sat through 2 hours of logistics discussion and then said something that the official record of the meeting captures in a single sentence. He said that the maintenance problem was a training problem, and that the solution was to take the 6 most experienced Mustang crew chiefs in England and put them on transport aircraft to every group in the theater simultaneously. Not sequentially. Simultaneously. 1 week per group. Show every maintenance team in person exactly what the Merlin cooling system required. The cost was 6 weeks of reduced availability from those 6 crew chiefs' home units. The alternative was 11 more aircraft lost per month to problems that had nothing to do with the enemy. The proposal was approved the following morning. By mid-May, non-combat mechanical losses had dropped to 2 per month. June 6, 1944 arrived 9 days later than Reynolds had expected it when he first read the planning documents. The Allied landings in Normandy represented the moment that everything the Mustang had spent 4 months achieving would either prove strategically decisive or reveal itself as incomplete. Because the question was never whether the P-51 could win air-to-air engagements against German fighters. That had been answered. The question was whether the air superiority it had established would hold over a specific geography at a specific time under conditions that the Germans would throw every available asset at disrupting. June 6, 1944, 5:30 a.m., the English Channel. Reynolds is at 20,000 feet, and the ocean below him is covered with ships. More ships than he has ever seen from altitude, more than he knew existed. More than seems possible from the intelligence briefings that describe the invasion fleet in numbers, rather than in the visual reality of 5,000 vessels extending from the English coast to the French shore. He has one mission: keep German aircraft away from the beaches. Every German plane that reaches the landing zones is a direct threat to men in open landing craft, to men on exposed beaches, to the entire operation that has been building since before he flew his first combat mission. He is not escorting bombers today. He is the defensive line between the sky and the largest amphibious operation in human history. The Germans come at 7:15. 2 FW-190 is dropped from cloud cover above the western flank of the landing zone, diving toward the beach at Utah sector, where American infantry are still wading ashore. Reynolds sees them at the moment they begin their dive. He pushes the throttle to military power. The Merlin surges. He is closing from the side, not from behind, using the angle, rather than trying to chase from a distance he cannot close in time. The FW-19Os are committed to their attack run. They cannot maneuver without losing the speed that makes the attack possible. Reynolds fires at the lead aircraft from 400 yards, 20 rounds. The FW-19O pulls sharply left, trailing smoke, and its dive becomes uncontrolled. It impacts the water 200 yards short of the beach. The second FW-19O aborts its run, pulls up, runs east. Reynolds does not chase. He climbs back to altitude. Below him, the men on Utah Beach do not know what just happened above them. They never will. This is not a dramatic battle. It is work. Fast, precise, exhausting work conducted at altitudes between 5,000 and 25,000 feet, over 50 miles of coastline for 9 hours. Mustang pilots intercept German aircraft attempting to reach the beaches 127 times on June 6. 104 of those intercepts result in the German aircraft turning back or being destroyed before reaching the landing zones. The Luftwaffe manages 11 attack runs against the invasion fleet and the beaches. 11 out of 127 attempts. The German air forces that the Allied planners had feared most, the forces that could have turned the beaches into a catastrophe, fly 319 sorties over Normandy on June 6. The Royal Air Force and the 8th Air Force fly 14,674 sorties. The ratio is not a product of June 6. It is the product of every mission flown since March 6. Every German pilot killed over Germany in the preceding 3 months is a pilot who is not over Normandy. Every Me-262 factory bombed, every fuel depot strafed, every airfield hit on the return leg of a Berlin escort mission. All of it is present in that ratio, in ways that no single statistic can fully capture. By June 7th, it was clear that German air opposition to the invasion was not going to materialize at the scale that defensive planners had prepared for. Luftwaffe units that should have been at full strength were instead operating at 55 to 60% pilot availability. Aircraft that should have been fueled and armed were grounded by fuel shortages that traced directly back to bombing campaigns the Mustangs had escorted to completion in April and May. The German fighter force over Normandy was not defeated on June 6. It had been defeated over Germany in the 3 months before the invasion began. The numbers that emerged from post-mission analysis in the weeks following D-Day confirmed what Reynolds and every pilot who had flown the Berlin missions already understood intuitively. Between January and June 1944, 8th Air Force P-51 units had destroyed 1,327 German aircraft in air-to-air combat. They had lost 131 Mustangs to all air combat causes. The ratio was just over 10 to 1. German pilot losses during the same period included a disproportionate number of veterans, men with 50 or more aerial victories, men whose experience was irreplaceable and whose absence from the cockpit on June 6 was as significant as any single tactical outcome. The Luftwaffe had approximately 1,900 fighter pilots in the West in January 1944. By June 6, that number was approximately 1,200, and the 700 missing represented a concentration of experience and capability that no training program running on reduced fuel allocations could rebuild in any relevant time frame. The recognition that followed was real, but muted in the way that recognition during active wartime always is. Several 8th Air Force P-51 group commanders received Distinguished Service Medals. Individual pilots accumulated Distinguished Flying Crosses in numbers that made the decoration almost routine. Reynolds was promoted to major in July 1944. He received no ceremony. The promotion order was delivered with the morning briefing documents. He signed the acknowledgement form and went to the flight line to pre-flight his aircraft. There was a mission at 0800. By August 1944, the Luftwaffe's response to the Mustang had evolved into something that the original German doctrine would not have recognized. Fighter units were being held back from engagement rather than committed to intercept conserving pilots and aircraft for a strategic reserve that German planners hoped to deploy at a moment of decisive importance. The aggressive coordinated intercept tactics that had made the Luftwaffe so dangerous in 1943 had been replaced by something more cautious, more calculating, and fundamentally more defensive. The German fighter force was no longer contesting Allied air superiority. It was preserving itself against a future that was becoming harder to imagine with each passing week. But Reynolds, reading the intelligence summary on August 15, 1944, noticed something that the summary described as a statistical anomaly, but that he read differently. Me-262 sightings had increased sharply in the previous 2 weeks, not over the front lines, over the aircraft factories in southern Germany. Germany was accelerating production, and the jet that had appeared 17 times in April and 31 times in May had appeared 63 times in August. Whatever the Luftwaffe was conserving its conventional forces for, the answer appeared to be connected to a runway in Bavaria and an engine that ran on a different principle than anything Reynolds had ever tried to intercept. The man who had helped change the air war over Europe would now have to confront the possibility that the war was about to change again in ways that the P-51's range and performance could not simply overcome by arriving earlier and staying later. The question of what Reynolds and the 8th Air Force did next, and what it cost them, and what it ultimately meant for the war's final chapter, is a story that history has largely told through statistics and after-action reports. But the man who lived it remembered it differently, and that story, the final chapter of what the Mustang was and what it became, is the one chapter that most accounts of the air war over Europe have never fully told. From an aircraft that wasn't supposed to reach Berlin, to a kill ratio that broke the Luftwaffe's spine, to air superiority over the beaches of Normandy, on the most consequential day of the 20th century, the P-51 Mustang had traveled a distance in 4 months that no one who attended those early procurement meetings would have predicted. Captain Jack Reynolds had flown from RAF Debden to Berlin and back before most of the generals responsible for that mission believed it was possible. The Me-262 threat had sharpened in the final months of 1944, and Reynolds had read every intelligence summary about it with the focused attention of a man who understood that the jet represented the one variable the Mustang's range could not simply outrun. But the war ended before the Me-262 reached production numbers that could have changed the outcome. The question that history rarely asks about men like Reynolds is not what they accomplished. It is what happened to them afterward. And the answer in most cases is quieter than the story that preceded it. Reynolds flew his last combat mission on April 16, 1945. He did not know it was his last at the time. German fuel shortages had grounded most of what remained of the Luftwaffe's conventional fighter force, and the mission, a sweep over airfields in central Germany, found nothing airborne worth engaging. He strafed a locomotive and 2 fuel trucks on the return leg from habit more than strategic necessity. The war in Europe ended 22 days later. He was 24 years old, had flown 137 combat missions, accumulated 9 confirmed aerial victories, and received the Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters. He signed the paperwork acknowledging the promotion to lieutenant colonel in June 1945. The same week he signed the paperwork requesting separation from the service. He went home to Ohio. He did not fly jets. He did not pursue the post-war career in aviation that several of his squadron mates built at the newly designated United States Air Force. He worked for 12 years as an engineer at a manufacturing firm in Dayton, a job that suited the same precise, systematic thinking that had made him an effective fighter pilot, without requiring him to carry the specific weight that combat flying had accumulated on his shoulders over 137 missions. He married in 1947. He had 3 children. He attended one reunion of his fighter group in 1953 and found the experience sufficiently complicated that he did not attend another for 11 years. He was not bitter. That distinction matters. Men who felt their contributions had gone unrecognized often carried a specific kind of grievance that Reynolds did not appear to share. He simply moved on, the way that many of the men who did the most consequential work of that war moved on without requiring the work to be continuously acknowledged in order for the life that followed to feel worthwhile. He watched the Korean War from Dayton, knowing that F-51s, his aircraft renamed with the new Air Force designation, were flying close air support missions over terrain that looked nothing like the North Sea or the outskirts of Berlin. He did not volunteer to return. He understood that the Mustang's time as a frontline aircraft was ending, and he had no desire to be present for the ending. The Doosan that Reynolds left behind him without fully knowing it was not in the citations attached to his Distinguished Flying Cross. It was in the structural transformation of how the United States military thought about the relationship between range and air superiority, a transformation that his missions over Germany had helped force into institutional consciousness in ways that outlasted the specific aircraft that produced them. The P-51 Mustang's core lesson was deceptively simple. An escort that cannot reach the target is not an escort. It is a symbolic gesture that costs lives. That lesson, apparently obvious in retrospect, had required the deaths of thousands of bomber crewmen and the near collapse of the entire strategic bombing campaign before the procurement system accepted it. Once accepted, it shaped every subsequent American fighter development program for the next 30 years. The F-86 Sabre that fought MiG-15s over Korea incorporated range considerations that the P-47 and early P-38 had treated as secondary to performance metrics. The F-4 Phantom, which flew over Vietnam 2 decades later, carried external fuel capacity that its designers justified partly by citing 8th Air Force operational data from 1944. The concept of the long-range fighter escort, once considered a contradiction in terms, by men who believed performance and endurance were mutually exclusive, became a baseline requirement rather than an aspiration. More than 15,000 P-51 Mustangs were built between 1940 and 1945. They served in the air forces of 55 nations after the war ended. The last confirmed combat use of the Mustang in frontline military service occurred in 1984, when the Dominican Air Force retired its final airworthy examples 44 years after North American aviation first designed the airframe in 117 days to meet a British specification. No aircraft in history had a longer gap between design inception and frontline retirement. The airframe that was never meant to escort bombers at altitude outlasted every aircraft designed to replace it in every air force that operated it long enough to find out. The civilian racing community that adopted surplus Mustangs after the war extended the airframe's life in a different direction entirely. Modified Mustangs at the Reno air races regularly exceeded 500 miles per hour at low-altitude speeds the original engineering team had not designed for, and the wartime pilots had never attempted. The laminar flow wing that had been revolutionary in 1940 proved to be so aerodynamically efficient that competitive racers were still exploiting its properties 60 years after it was first tested. In 2023, a restored P-51D flew at an air show in California before an audience that included 2 men in their late 90s who had flown the aircraft in combat. The aerodynamics that made it relevant in 2023 were the same aerodynamics that had kept Reynolds's fuel gauge reading healthy over Germany in 1944. The deeper lesson of the Mustang story is not about aerodynamics. It is about the specific kind of institutional resistance that greets genuinely useful ideas before the evidence in favor of them becomes impossible to ignore. Williamson was not a foolish man. He was a careful one, applying the wrong framework to a situation that required a different kind of calculation. The procurement system that had delayed Merlin engine Mustang production for 18 months, while bomber crews died at rates that should have constituted an emergency, was not corrupt or incompetent. It was optimized for a world in which the assumptions built into it were valid, and it could not update those assumptions fast enough when the evidence against them accumulated in body counts rather than performance metrics. That failure is not unique to 1943. It reappears with remarkable consistency whenever an established system encounters a solution that requires changing the assumptions the system was built to protect. The men who pushed the Mustang through that resistance, Hitchcock writing cables from London that Washington treated as the enthusiastic advocacy of a man without proper institutional standing. Christian arguing in conference rooms against generals with more rank and less recent combat experience. Auton designing a 5-mission evaluation that bypassed the official review timeline by going directly to Arnold were not mavericks in any romantic sense. They were men who understood that the evidence they had was correct, and that the cost of waiting for institutional comfort to catch up with that evidence was being measured in 10-man bomber crews that did not come home. The willingness to accept personal professional risk in service of a conclusion the data supported is not a personality trait. It is a choice made repeatedly under conditions that reward caution and punish failure. That choice is present in virtually every significant military innovation of the 20th century. The carrier-based aviation advocates who spent the 1930s arguing against battleship-first naval doctrine. The airborne assault pioneers who convinced skeptical ground commanders that parachute infantry could seize objectives conventional forces could not reach. The radar development teams who fought budget constraints and institutional indifference for a decade before the Battle of Britain demonstrated the technology's value in terms that could not be argued with. In each case, the pattern is identical. Correct idea. Institutional resistance. Champions willing to accept personal risk. Proof generated under conditions that made refusal impossible. Adoption too slow to prevent some of the losses that earlier adoption would have avoided. Legacy that outlasts the resistance. Here is the detail that most accounts of the P-51 Mustang program do not include. The original British specification that North American aviation responded to in 1940, the specification that produced the airframe in 117 days, was not a specification for a long-range escort fighter. It was a specification for a medium-altitude tactical aircraft to replace aircraft already in production. The RAF wanted something faster than what they had. They did not ask for range. They did not ask for high-altitude performance. They received an airframe so aerodynamically clean that when the right engine was installed 2 years later, it became something the specification had never requested and the designers had never intended. The most consequential fighter aircraft of the European Air War was an accident of geometry. The laminar flow wing that gave the Mustang its range efficiency at altitude was designed to reduce drag at medium altitude and medium speed. It happened to perform exceptionally well at high altitude and high speed because the physics of laminar flow do not care what the design intent was. The aircraft that changed the air war was not designed to change the air war. It was designed to be faster than what already existed, and the consequences of that singular goal cascaded outward in ways that no one at North American Aviation's Inglewood facility could have traced on a planning document in 1940. Reynolds learned this detail in 1973 when a historian writing a technical study of the P-51 program contacted him for an interview. Reynolds read the relevant sections of the manuscript before the interview and sat with them for a long time before he responded. He told the historian that he found it simultaneously unsurprising and difficult to process. Unsurprising because nothing about the way the aircraft had entered service, fought its way through institutional resistance, and eventually transformed the air campaign had followed a logical sequence from a specific intended outcome. Difficult to process because 137 combat missions and 9 confirmed kills feel like they should have been in service of a plan, and the idea that the plan had been an accident of aerodynamics left him with a feeling he could not fully name. He named it eventually in the same interview. He said it felt like the war had been won by people who were paying attention. From a mechanic's apprentice from Ohio who learned to fly on instinct to a fighter pilot who followed the bombers to Berlin when every previous escort had turned back to a retired engineer in Dayton who watched his aircraft race at air shows decades after the war ended, the P-51 Mustang story is ultimately not about the aircraft. It is about what happens when the right tool reaches the right hands at the right moment, and the people holding it refused to turn around. More than 15,000 Mustangs. More than 4,950 confirmed aerial victories in the European theater. Bomber loss rates cut by nearly 2/3 on missions that once killed men at rates the 8th Air Force could not sustain. That is what paying attention looks like measured in the only currency that matters in wartime. People who came home.